Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the SQL Presents webinar. I'm Nick Andrews, Business Development Director at SQL. We're going to be exploring the topic of change, the psychology of work, and keeping employees motivated. We originally had the idea of this session back in January, and recent events, of course, have made this even more pertinent than it was before. We're delighted, therefore, to welcome Deborah Hume as our guest presenter today. Deborah is founder of Minerva Engagement, a change and engagement consultancy specializing in applying neuroscience in businesses, driving performance and improving well-being. At times like these, Deborah's insight can help communicators like ourselves work with our leaders to ensure employees continue to feel valued, engaged and motivated. So it's going to be a fascinating topic and a session. Hope you'll enjoy it. Please feel free to ask any questions or make any comments during Deborah's presentation using the Q&A function, and we'll address those at the end of the formal session. We'll also be making Deborah's presentation and associated documents available after today. And in the meantime, for those of you feeling particularly stressed, whether you're homeschooling or just snowed under with Zoom calls or other demands from your colleagues, or just needing 10 minutes me time, there's an optional short meditation session to finish this morning's get-together. It is optional, but it'd be great to see you taking part. Without further ado, it therefore gives me great pleasure to introduce Deborah. Deborah, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thanks, Nick, and hello, everyone. I am really pleased to be here with you today, and I hope you're having a good Thursday ahead of our bank holiday weekend, which hopefully will seem different to every other weekend over the last 5 or 6 weeks or so. Today, I'm going to take you through my thoughts and views on things that we can think around engagement in a changing world. I'd like us to explore a little bit what that means for leadership and communication, and perhaps the relationship between leadership and communication and the impact that they may have on our organizations. And also think about the distinction between trust and psychological safety, and what that means and how we might work with that from a communications perspective. And then bringing it all together with sort of a 3-step change model. And we are aware that there are many, many change models out there. This is just a way of synthesizing some of the learning from neuroscience particularly into a model that we can remember and perhaps consider as part of our thinking when we're discussing change. And we are in an environment that is changing really rapidly. I think for me, it's one of these black swan events that kind of came out of nowhere and has completely knocked us all sideways. And if we think back to November or December time, I don't think that there's anybody anywhere who would have thought for a second that what was going to happen in March was going to happen. I mean, our whole world, and it is literally the world, has been turned completely upside down. So it's not just impacting our organizations, it's also impacting our social lives, our family lives, our friendship groups, the way that we go about in the world. Everything has changed, which has brought in a level of uncertainty that we're not used to handling. And I know that many of our organizations go through, and have been for a number of years and decades, going through quite considerable change and transformation, but nothing on the scale that we are currently seeing with all aspects of our lives impacted. So it brings certain challenges, but I also think it brings certain opportunities as well. And this is where, for me, it gets exciting, both for internal communicators particularly, and also for leadership, because it's forcing us to think about things and look at introducing habits and embedding ways of working that we've talked about for a very long time, but we never had any real need to do. Whereas now we have a real need to do it, and it's going to impact everything. And I think one of the things that's popped into my head over the last few weeks is the impact it's going to have on the psychological contract that exists between our employees and our employers. We do a lot of work around psychological contracts. We do a lot of work making sure people feel comfortable and that they buy into the purpose and that they understand the values of an organization, and we treat our employees well, and we hope that they consider us a good employer. And there's lots of activities that go on internally to do that. But I think going forward, dependent on what happens, and nobody knows what's going to happen, really. We don't know whether there's going to be a second wave. We don't know whether there'll be another COVID 2026 or COVID 2023. Nobody knows. So the psychological contract in my head now is no longer necessarily just between the employee and the employer. It extends out, because if we're asking our employees to work in their home environments, then actually there's other people in those home environments that we need to consider. And we've never really needed to consider them that much before. So, am I working in an environment where I'm homeschooling at the same time? And what does that mean for my working day? Am I working in an environment where I'm completely on my own and totally isolated? What does that mean for my mental health? And all of these things, I think, as employers and certainly as communication experts, we're going to have to think around and consider how we position them and how we work through the messaging. So that brings a number of challenges, both for leadership and for communication. And I think internal communicators have really stood up to the plate during this period, and there's been a massive amount of communication circulating around our organizations to try and help our employees understand what's happening, what we need to do, how we're going to cope with furlough, all of the other things that we've been dealing with. And that communication capability, I believe over time, will be more dispersed. And by that, I mean, we will need to build the capability and the skills of our leadership community. So we will always need to have very professional communication capability within the organization to manage the messaging, to manage the tools, to ensure that everything's consistent and chunked down and all of the things that we know about. But we can't do it on our own, because those individuals who are locked away in all of those houses or wherever they happen to be are going to be speaking to their managers regularly, and it's their managers that actually end up being our front line. And if they don't have the skills and the capability, and there's no reason to suggest that they would actually, at the minute, have the level of capability that is required, it's very difficult. And I think it's hard for us to put them in a situation where they are managing quite a lot of the emotion that is going on amongst all of us. And I count myself in that bracket. So being able to support those leaders and help them build their capability, I think, will become an important part of what we do. And there will become, I think, a bigger distinction between leadership and management. So we've talked a lot about leadership. We've started to build leadership capabilities over the last number of decades, but there's always been this grey area. What's a manager? What's a leader? Do we just promote great managers into leaders and then expect them to lead? I actually think as we go forward, one of the opportunities that could come out of this is that there's a lot more clarity about what we mean by leadership and what we mean by a leadership discipline. And actually, we might have brilliant managers and we pay them as brilliant managers, but they're not leaders. The leaders have different competencies. They've developed their agility and their innovation and their collaboration and their understanding of how human biology and physiology works, so that they can create motivation with individuals, regardless of whether they're in a home or in an office location, which brings with it certain accountabilities and responsibilities. And I think it may be now that we spend a lot more time, yes, assessing whether individuals have leadership capability from a technical point of view. Absolutely. They need to know the basics and they need to understand the ins and outs of their profession. But actually, do they have the right capability to really, really lead, motivate, care for employees in quite difficult and really changing circumstances? Are they more command control? Not very helpful if somebody's, based at home or the team is spread between 30 homes. How do you command and control that? You can't. So that brings in trust. It brings in a focus on clear objectives. It brings in feedback loops, performance. It brings in looking at outputs rather than inputs. A really sort of a real shift in what we're actually thinking about. I think the other side of it is, how do we build this relationship and community and the repurposing of purpose? And as communicators, we have a big role in that. You'll see as we start to go through this presentation the relevance of relationship and community and how that can keep us together and keep us working together as a team. And also, what do we mean by purpose? I think the purpose of a lot of our organizations will shift and adapt over the coming weeks and months. It's not to say that it changes completely, but the perspective of us as individuals has shifted. I've noticed the conversation, we're a lot more aware of environments. I know that was kicking off anyway before COVID-19, but people are noticing that pollution is reduced. People are noticing that we don't have to travel quite so much. All of these things, I think, will cause organizations just to take a little bit of time to think through, what is our purpose in this new world? Is it still relevant, or do we need to rethink it? So it's quite an interesting moment in time. What does this mean for our organizations? Well, there's some things that we should obviously keep doing, and we've started to do really well. We've done a lot of work around values and driving behaviors, and I know that we're quite familiar with competency sets, and some organizations have done brilliantly with that and really started to bring them to life. For others, maybe there's still a poster on the wall or something we talk about at conferences. As we deal with this change, this black swan type change, those values and living those values are going to become more and more and more important. And that's going to have an impact on communication, but it's also going to have an impact on our leadership line. Mindsets, that's become quite a normal part of the lexicon over the last few years. We are much more aware now that what we think drives our emotion, which drives our feeling, which drives ultimately those behaviors. So what is the mindset that prevails around this organization? Is it actually in line with what we're trying to do? We say that we're really innovative, but from a diversity point of view, it's perhaps not looking great. How does that match? Where is our mindset on this? So we've had some interesting conversations. I think the area where we're really struggling still is this emotion feelings bit. When it gets into that work environment, we have this view that we need to be professional, and professional we do need to be, but it's almost as though our emotional self gets left at the door, and everybody in our organizations is rational and knows what to do and how to handle themselves and will respond in a certain way. And one of the things that we do now know from the neuroscience, if you like, is that's just not true. We spend most of our time in our emotional self. Our rational self is quite a limited resource. So if we don't build our knowledge of emotion and feelings, if we don't understand that the majority of the time people are listening and reacting to what we say from an emotional space, then we keep talking at them rationally, thinking they're listening rationally when they're actually not, and then wondering why we keep missing the beat. So building our understanding and bringing emotion as a real thing into organizations, for me, is quite important. And in this situation where emotion is really top line right now, I don't know many people who are not feeling those emotions, and it manifests through anger, it manifests through tiredness in the afternoon. I've spoken to so many people who just want to go to bed at 2:00 in the afternoon. It manifests in nightmares. It manifests in not being able to sleep. That is the emotional self struggling to cope with what's going on. So we need to understand that to be able to move forward. And when we don't, and when our leaders don't, it brings problems with it. And it's unfortunate, Catherine Calderwood, I'm sure I'm using her, but there are other examples. I'm sure you've heard of this. And she was the Scottish Chief Medical Officer, stood on the podium, told everybody they needed to isolate, don't go to your second homes. And then she was snapped at her second home with family on a walk, and consequently stood down from her position. And what that said to me was, leadership going forward is going to be a 24/7 occurrence. And that's why I think accountability and responsibility, and being really overt about that when promoting our leaders, is so important. Because every single one of us has a camera on our phone, and the majority of us has a phone. So when we see something out and about that isn't quite right, or doesn't fit with what a person or an organization said, we will take a photograph, as whoever did with this instance, and we send it to the media, or we send it through our social platforms. And before we know it, the reputation of the individual or the reputation of the organization is in tatters. And I think in our organizations, leadership will start to be viewed much more like the police force. If you're in the police force and you've chosen to be a police officer, you can't go and do drugs on a Saturday or speed down the motorway, because if you get caught, you're fired. So if a leader is going to step into this leadership situation and if you like, be the custodian of an organizational purpose and the values and the mindsets and the care that we say we have for our employees, that's a big responsibility. And I'm sure you all remember United Airlines in 2016 with that passenger being dragged off. That was another snapshot that went everywhere. And I think it knocked about $1 billion off their share price in 24 hours. So these things have big repercussions. So if we're kind of thinking around that, what does that mean in terms of, behavior and who we are and how we operate? And we don't have time right now to go through absolutely everything, but I did want to mention threat and reward, because I think this is quite important to understand. And there's a lot of science that sits behind it. But essentially, the top line is that as human beings, we operate on a continuum of threat and reward. So we're either in a state of threat or we're in a state of reward. And when we're in threat, very disengaged, reward, engaged. The important point is that it's 5 times easier, roughly, for us to move to threat than it is to be in reward. So it's very, very hard to keep us engaged, and we have to really work at it in terms of the language that we're using, the things that we're saying, and what we're doing. And when we're in threat, that's when or moving that way, that's when our emotional self is in full flow and our rational self is switched off. That's when our ability to collaborate and build relationship is almost non-existent. Now, if you think about what's happening at the moment with this COVID-19, I would defy anybody to say that they are happily standing in reward, whether you're the Prime Minister or whether you're one of those fabulous key workers in hospital or supermarket. Everybody, including myself, is in a form of threat state, and we're seeing threats everywhere. So for an organization, just to kind of sit with that for a minute, okay, so what do we then have to do to really help our people? And that's where relationship and talking and being there and being supportive starts to pull people backwards and forwards towards reward. And that's all where the energy and the relationship elements and the trust, usually in ideal situations we've built in the good times, then rides us through those bad times. And again, just sort of moving on the neuroscience piece, I just want to kind of clarify some of the things that support and some of the things that get in the way of trust. And I'm not going to make this too sciencey, but again, from a comms perspective and also from a leadership perspective, I think it's really helpful to understand this, because we talk about trust a lot. We're going to build trust. We're going to try and create a trusting environment. But we don't really, and I put my hand up, really understand what that actually means from a physiological and a biological sort of level. So there was a guy called Paul Zak who he's a neuroscientist, and he's done much research over the last 2 or 3 decades on, he wanted to research morality effectively. He wanted to understand if there was something in us that made us more moral. And he's written a fantastic book called The Moral Molecule. And he used, in order to assess morality, which is a very difficult concept to assess, he needed something to study that was actually, that could be measured. And he chose trust and trustworthiness. And the reason that he chose trust and trustworthiness, which is why it's relevant to us, is because there's a lot of data and research that show that the countries that are most trustworthy are the most prosperous. So he used that to sort of anchor his research. And his research took place over a number of years. He did it in the lab, out of the lab, with all sorts of different people. He even went to Papua New Guinea, to a tribe that was very remote. And he used money as the currency to assess trust and trustworthiness. He used a variety of techniques. So he took blood samples, he put sprays up the nose, he took scans. There was all sorts of things that he carried around with him. And what he found was that there was a link, a very strong link, direct link, between oxytocin production, oxytocin is a hormone, and levels of trust. And oxytocin has been ignored for many years because it was considered something that was just female. It was just what females produced when they gave birth or they were suckling babies. But actually, it's not just female. It applies to females and males. And the reason it's so interesting is because within us, it sort of starts from a zero base. And to produce it, it needs to be stimulated. But what he found was that when oxytocin levels are high within us, we have high trust. When oxytocin levels are low or our receptors are damaged, we have hardly any trust or trustworthiness. And they had a word in his lab, and you'll have to excuse my French, but they had a word in his lab for people that were considered untrustworthy and shown through the assessments to be untrustworthy. And they used to call them the bastards. And the reason that they called them that was because they were almost psychopaths. They had very little oxytocin. They couldn't stimulate oxytocin. They didn't trust anybody, and they weren't trustworthy. And I'm sure we've kind of all met one or two of those. So why is it of importance to us as communicators? Because actually, the thing, and also to our organizations, because the things that inhibit oxytocin are things like improper nurturing. Now, we can't do much about that when they reach organizations, but as we bring up children, if we bring them up in a very toxic environment, it massively stunts their ability to produce oxytocin later in life. The other two things that actually stunt oxytocin production are very high stress environments. So environments that are very highly pressured, where we've got functions that may be set up against each other, or if you've got a very highly driven sales team, and as an organization, we set one person against another. So as we start to increase the stress and the testosterone, which happens when we do a lot of competition, and testosterone is in men and women, there's just more of it in men, there's about 10 times as much in males as there is in females. But if we build these high stress, high testosterone environments, or if they create by default, because we haven't done anything to cultivate a more benevolent environment, then actually the oxytocin production within our teams and organizations will be very low. If it's very low, you can't build trust. It's been kind of almost proved beyond doubt by Paul Zak. So it's like oil and water. How do we then create an environment where oxytocin and trust, and therefore engagement and all of the things we say we want, really shines and exists? And the stimulators of oxytocin are things like connection, which is why this isolation period is difficult, and why Zoom and the technology that we've now got available, Teams and all of the things we use, is so essential. The more we connect, the more we talk to people. When we get out of isolation, the more physical contact we have with people, the more our oxytocin within each of us is naturally increased. Social activity is really important. And for me, this is a key one for communicators, because what has been shown is that when social media is used really well, and I'm not talking about when it's abused, when it works well, when it's used properly, when people engage with it, oxytocin levels have been shown to double in the individuals that are involved with that social media and engaged with that social media. So you can start to see, from a cultural point of view, there are things that we can actually actively do that have a direct influence on the individuals within that and the teams that exist within that particular environment. Now, it might be for some environment, trust is not appropriate. We might want to drive, it's not something I would sign up to, but we might want to drive high stress, high pressure type environments, in which case that's fine, but let's not waste our time trying to say that we want to be trusting and trusted, because it's just not going to happen. And I think understanding that clarity and getting that clarity is quite important. So before we start to wrap up, I just want to clarify quickly what I mean when I talk about trust and why it's different from psychological safety. So trust is about giving others the benefit of the doubt. So it would happen between individuals. So I might trust you, but it's what I think about you and what exists in my mind about you, and how I might view or think about what you're going to do. And the trust can also exist between me and an organization. So it's an expectation that I have about whether you as an individual or you as an organization can be counted on. And there's a lot of work that we can do as communicators to build that through the interactions that we create, the messaging and the narrative that we write, the purpose and how we position it, the values that we support, that starts to build my understanding in my own mind about whether you're trustworthy as an organization or whether you're not. Psychological safety is slightly different. So psychological safety is whether I think my team will give me the benefit of the doubt if I say something or do something that they might not agree with. So, for example, am I in an environment where I feel that I can really speak up and be honest about my views, knowing that my team around me will be glad I spoke up, even if they don't agree, and happy to have the conversation? Or am I in a situation where if I speak up, they're going to give me my P45 because my face doesn't fit? That's psychological safety. So it's about whether I feel, and if I make a mistake, that would be another example. I don't mean a process mistake that I've done over and over again, but we're in a very fast moving environment. I might not just get it right first time. Are they going to support me and help me work out a solution to the problem that might have been created? Or again, are they going to put me on suspension? And that psychological safety element, it really sits with the leaders. And you can be in organizations, and I've seen it, and I'm sure you guys have as well, where one team just seems to operate beautifully and everybody's happy and they're doing what they need to do and the performance is there and it just seems to sing along. And then another team, it's cranky and scratchy and people are leaving and people don't want to go there and everybody's bitching and it's just horrible. And the difference primarily will have been the leader and the environment that's been created and how they're interacting with their teams, which is why I think communication and leadership will become much closer with the communicators. We have such a fantastic opportunity to provide specialist advice and input in how to build those relationships, because I don't think we can just expect that the leaders that we have know how to do it. I think it's almost unfair, actually, to put them in those situations without any support. I was talking to one of the leaders that we work with a couple of weeks ago, actually. It was quite interesting. And he was saying that he was spending so much time on Zoom. He said, I'm on Zoom all the time. I'm just having conversations with my team. He said, I keep updating them. I keep telling them what's going on. I'm taking questions. He said, I'm just doing so much. It's added to my workload by 30%. He said, but it's fascinating. He said, it's just the engagement's gone through the roof. We're all getting on so much better. But Deborah, I can't handle it. Why can't you handle it? Because I haven't got hours in the day to do it. But that is leadership. So what else are you doing? Well, I'm doing this and this. Well, can you not outsource that to somebody else or give it to one of your team to do? Because you shouldn't be doing that. That's operational. But that's what I do. No. Well, it might have been, but this is showing you something. Your role is a leadership role. The 30% of time that you're now doing and taking to engage with your team, getting your team to perform well, is valuable. The other stuff, yeah, keep what you have to, but the rest of it, get rid of it. Don't get rid of the 30% that you've just taken on finally. And it was a fascinating conversation because he hadn't quite understood it. And, this is a very intelligent, very successful individual. So just to finish off then, what's this 3-step change model? So bearing in mind what I've been talking about, and I am aware that we've gone through it at quite a fast pace and there is a whole load of information that sits underneath some of these top line things that I've been talking about. The first one for me is, how do we create this toward state? If it's so easy to disengage people, what sort of things can we do? And, making it safe to talk and to talk about the future is a key one. One of the things that I know some organizations have introduced, and we've certainly introduced, is this content-free meeting. So we're all quite keen to put meetings in the diary to discuss objectives and performance. Yes, absolutely necessary. But actually, sometimes, particularly now, a content-free call, we're just going to get on the call. Anything you want to talk about is fine. Really helps because it allows people to speak and to speak up. I think we've got a role in terms of comms. How do we ensure people stay connected through the messaging? How do we frame the conversations? Language is so important. Sometimes we're we're really keen on making sure that we get the facts right, and we don't scan those emails to see whether the language actually is going to promote more fearful reactions or it's going to help people be more settled. So what can we do with that? And maintaining that solutions focus rather than focusing on the problem, because some of you will know our brain rewires itself quite happily, and it will focus and rewire according to what we're thinking about. So if we're constantly thinking on the problem and not the solution, then it's the problem that we stay focused on and we don't move forward. So facilitating these new connections for me is really important. How do we connect? What can we do if everybody is in different places? How do we support? What does that mean for our leadership? And how do we also capture some of these fabulous ideas that people are thinking about? Because, we're not commuting. The hours have changed, the days have changed, the weeks don't feel like weeks anymore. Saturday's a Wednesday and Wednesday's a Sunday, and I don't quite know which end is up. All of the habits and all of the things that have defined us and structured us for years are blown up. But that means that it's providing a window of light and some opportunity for new things to fly in that we hadn't actually thought about before. And I know it's happened in my head, and more things that I perhaps hadn't considered before because I thought that was the way things were always done. So there's a whole load of innovation that's going on in people's minds that it would be great to capture. So how are we going to capture that? How do we question for insight and really bring it into the future and use it to help us move forward? And then I've alluded to this, the embedding of new wiring. And for me, this is important. If we're going to change anything, whether we're doing it on a personal level or on an organizational level, it means that we have to rewire the brain. And our brain has to work in a different way, which means that it's effortful to change habits, which is why when we land thousands of things on people and don't chunk it down in organizations, they just don't get it. So simplification and being focused on what we actually do want to change. 1 thing, 2 at most, 3, forget it. And if you relate that to your personal lives, it's the same thing. If you want to start exercising, focus on exercising, but don't focus on exercising, trying to eat new food, trying to get to bed earlier, trying to change your dress sense, trying all at the same time. Because if you do, you won't do anything. So again, I think just be aware that it's effortful asking people to change and create new habits, and sometimes we don't allow enough time or support for that. So I'm very conscious that I've probably run over time a little bit. I'm just going to sum up very quickly. We are in a changing world. It's bringing lots of challenges. There is a lot of anxiety, and I know masses of upset and worry around, which means that there is a huge role for our leaders and for us as communicators to help people and support people through that. It's bringing up new opportunities because, how many people really knew how to handle Zoom before all this started? Whoa, not so many. How many people thought that they had to be at a meeting face to face, otherwise it just wouldn't go ahead or it wouldn't work? Quite a lot. How many people traveled 4 hours to get to a half-hour meeting and back again in a day and thought that was okay? Yeah, quite a few. So actually, all of that's been blown up. We now know that we can do things that we didn't think we could do. So that's bringing lots of opportunity in itself. Leadership and communication, I think there's a big role for communicators to really help leaders. I think leadership will redefine itself, and they're going to need a lot of help and support to be great. And we need them to be great because there's millions of people that rely on our leaders being great because they're going to help us through. And that's about will and way. I'm not really going to go into that now because I am conscious we're running over time. But it's about the way is the process and the governance. The will is the hearts and the minds. We have to have both. If we've only got hearts and minds and we don't focus on performance, all we've got is a happy organisation that underperforms and probably will go bust. Which isn't helpful to anybody. If we've only got governance and process and we don't caretake and look after and support the engagement and the hearts and minds, we have that very stressed organisation that's going to have lots of anxiety, illness, and it's just not going to be great either. So we need both, and that brings in the importance of trust, psychological safety, and then that 3-step process that I went through very quickly, which is just a headline in terms of things that we can think about. So I think that brings me finally, Nick, to a conclusion. So I shall just hand back to you to see if you have any questions.
Thanks, Deborah. That's fascinating. Great introduction to what is a really interesting subject. Yes, a few questions have flooded in. First one is, what are the most positive things that Deborah has seen come out of the current crisis from an organisational or leadership perspective? So what's the positive out of this?
Oh, I think from the leadership and the organisational perspective, actually, because we're working with a few, is that the leaders are really focused on how they can support and engage their employees and what they need to do and how they need to build their capabilities. So they are the door is wide open, whereas before it was always a bit of a tussle to get them to understand that actually this communication stuff and this engagement stuff is not just a nice to have, it's really essential. So for me, I'm starting to see leaders actively thinking about and looking at what do we now need to do to improve this, because we've been caught wanting.
Okay. A related question, actually. Will the pandemic make organisations more aware of neuroscience in business? And if so, how might that manifest itself?
Sorry, Nick, could you just repeat that?
Sorry. Will the pandemic make organisations more aware of neuroscience in business, and how might that manifest itself?
Yes, I think so. I do believe so. And we're starting to see it now because we've got people signing up to our portal, which is sort of introducing everybody to this topic, our training portal. But if we're going to be able to manage the emotional piece, which I've been talking about, then actually we need to understand behaviour, human behaviour, and we need to understand physiology, and we need to understand some of the things that we can do to be able to build that engagement and help performance. It's not just about well-being, it's also about performance. And neuroscience as a term sort of can scare quite a lot of people. We don't need to be neuroscientists. We don't need to understand. I mean, they go down into it in so much detail. But some of the outputs, like, for example, the work that's been undertaken by Paul Zak, which is just one example, or even Carol Dweck on mindset, the outputs that are coming through, we can simplify down and use to inform our internal strategies as to how we build these communities so that we can ride these difficult times and, day-to-day change in a really productive way that supports people and continues to drive the business forward. So I think it will increase a lot over the next few months and years.
Okay, a supplementary question. So how can we as internal communicators keep our leaders in particular, engaged, motivated, and themselves psychologically safe? We hear a lot about the shop floor, but what about our leaders? How can we do it practically?
I think the communicators and HR actually, maybe together, are in an ideal position to provide support to leaders. I work with a lot of leaders, and that point is absolutely correct. They're just as vulnerable. They are human like us. They're going through their own issues just as we are. And on top, we're asking them to caretake, look after, support the teams that report into them. So I think we do have a responsibility to make sure that they are comfortable and maybe set up calls with them, create a safe space where they can discuss from a leadership perspective their experiences, address their questions, and provide them with the tools and the training, if you like, that they need to be able to do what they need to do.
Okay, one final question, because I know we've got this 10-minute meditation and people's time is limited. How can organisations help teams create psychological safety at the moment when we're all so socially and physically distant? Is it easier or harder?
Well, it's harder because we're distant and we have to work harder at it. And that then comes back. There's a number of, that's a sort of multi-layered question, really. There are a number of different things that we can do. So the first place to start, I think, is building the awareness and the education amongst the leadership group. So that's really important because they're the ones that the teams are connecting into. There's also the relevance and the importance of communication and making sure that the messaging and the narrative is positioned correctly, that we are getting information out in a timely way, all of the things that we do. And then I think there is something around doing a regular check and assessment. And I know there's the assessment PS25 that we run, where you can actually measure levels of psychological safety team by team, and you can link it back into the results, back into the KPIs that you're measuring. And doing that every 3 months is helpful. And it's not even about actually a plethora of interventions. It's building the awareness from the leadership perspective, because when they can start seeing those results, it's not about us or anybody else coming in and saying, right, this is what you should do. Once they see the results and you've created that conversation and dialogue, they know what to do themselves most of the time, and they curate, and then you measure again, and that's very helpful as well.
That's great, Deborah, and thanks for your time this morning. Fascinating. As I said earlier, the slides from Deborah will be available afterwards, as well as other information you might want, and feel free to ask any further questions. In the meantime, I'm going to hand back over to Deborah now to introduce a 10-minute slot on mindfulness and a bit of meditation.
Thanks, Nick. I hope you enjoyed that. I am going to start the mindfulness session. I don't know how many of you have partaken or undertaken mindfulness in the past. The reason that it's quite helpful is that it just gives the brain a moment when it can relax. So if we concentrate on something, and it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's breath or gratitude, or even if it's just looking at the leaves on the tree, it brings the brain and the mind back to the present moment. Because for the rest of the time, we are usually in the past, awfulizing or ruminating on something that has happened, or we're in the future worrying about something that's going to happen. And that doesn't give us any peace. And particularly at the moment, where we're likely to be past or future, the brain doesn't get a rest, which is what causes all of the anxiety in the body and the sleep and everything else that we know of. So mindfulness is just one of the sort of emotional regulation techniques that is helpful to use. So I shall start it going in a moment. There is the disclaimer, and it'll just stay on the screen for a little while whilst you settle into your seats, and then it will start to play.
Mindfulness of breath. Mindfulness of breath forms a core practice which we can do anytime and anywhere. It is the practice that can be used to underpin all other practices. Whether you be on a train or sitting at your desk, take a few minutes to connect with your breath. It will bring you into the present moment, help you to reduce anxiety, and will give you a sense of groundedness and connection. Take a deep breath to begin. Sitting in a comfortable, upright position with your feet flat on the floor. Notice your body is being fully supported by the chair you are sitting on, with your back straight and your hands resting on your lap. Take a moment to become fully aware of your sitting position. And if it feels right, gently close your eyes, or just drop your gaze to a spot a few feet in front of you. As you allow your body to become still, slowly take your attention to your breath, following the breath as it enters into your body and as it leaves your body. You are not trying to change anything or make anything different. You are just following your breath as it moves into your body and moves out. You are simply becoming aware of the feelings you have associated with breathing. And if your mind wanders away from your breath, as minds do, without judgment, just slowly bring your attention back to your breath. Notice where your breath goes to as it enters into your body, the rise and fall of your stomach or your chest. Follow the breath as you inhale through your nose and exhale through your mouth. Notice how the abdomen gently expands on the in-breath and falls back towards the spine on the out-breath. You are not trying to do anything. You are not trying to get anywhere. You are simply here, right now, following your breath. And if you find your mind has wandered off into your thoughts, without judging, gently bring your attention back to your breathing and connect with each cycle of inhaling and exhaling, becoming fully conscious of your breath from moment to moment. Every time you find your mind wandering, gently bring it back to the present, back to the moment to moment, observing the flow of your breathing, using your breath as an anchor to focus your attention, to bring you back to the present whenever you notice that your mind is becoming absorbed or reactive. Using your breath to help you tune into a state of relaxed awareness and stillness. As you follow your breath, you may from time to time become aware of sensations within your body. As you keep your awareness on your breathing, see if it is possible to expand your awareness so that it includes a sense of your body as a whole as you sit there, feeling your body from head to toe and becoming aware of all the sensations in your body, so that now you are observing not only the flow of the breathing but of the sense of your body as a whole. Being fully present to whatever feelings and sensations come up for you in any moment, without judging them or reacting to them, just being fully here, fully aware. And again, Whenever you notice the mind wandering off, just bring it back. Bring it back to your breathing and your body as you sit here, not doing anything, just simply being, simply sitting, moment to moment, being fully present, fully with yourself. Just being with your breathing from moment to moment, just sitting in stillness, looking for nothing and being present to all. You're not trying to get anywhere or be anything. You're just sitting here with your attention on your breath, just as it is. Just being right here, right now, as you are. And as this practice comes to an end, start to widen your attention and bring yourself gently back into the room. And if it feels right, take a moment to acknowledge your connection to this mindfulness of breath meditation.
Thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoyed that. Have a great rest of the day and a good weekend. Thank you.